She said nothing. No text, no fight, no crying at the door, just silence. And that silence broke him more than 1,000 screaming breakups ever could. One morning, Frank woke up and realized the pillow next to him was cold. Not just cold, empty, and in that moment he knew she was gone. No warning, no closure, no explanation. But here's what makes it worse. That was 3 years ago, and he still dreams about her. He's remarried. He has a good life, a quiet routine, people who love him. But some nights she shows up in his sleep, in that same red sweater, in the same half smile, and every time he wakes up feeling like a piece of him is missing, but he doesn't know which piece. Frank whispered to no one. Why her? Why does someone who said nothing still echo so loud inside me? Most people say it's heartbreak, unfinished feelings, loneliness, but Carl Jung had a different answer. It wasn't love. It was projection. He didn't lose her. He lost the mirror she unknowingly held up to his soul. And once you've seen that reflection, you can't unsee it. Because this isn't just a story about her, it's the beginning of a story about him. And the part of himself he didn't even know was waiting to be found. Let me take you there. Frank is 61. He's not a man who breaks easily. He's lived through house fires, grief, divorce. The kind of pain that doesn't get posted online. The kind that just settles in your bones. He's remarried now, drives less, sleeps better, has a wife who folds his shirts and listens to old songs with him on Sunday mornings, but some mornings he still wakes up with her name on his lips, not his wife's, hers, the one who disappeared. They weren't together long, 3 months maybe, 4, no big promises, no dramatic ending, just this quiet understanding between them, and then nothing. She left like fall turns into winter, without asking if you were ready. And for years, Frank told himself it didn't matter, that she was just another chapter. Short, sweet, over, but if that were true, why does her absence still hum in the background of his life? It's not that he loved her more than anyone else. It's not even that he knew her. Not fully. But there was something about her, or maybe something about himself when he was with her, a version of him that felt wide open, stripped of performance, present, seen, not for what he did or fixed or gave, but simply for being there, being him. And when she left, he didn't just lose her. Woman, he lost a mirror, the kind that doesn't show your face, but your soul, and no one warned him what that would feel like, what it would do to a man, to be awakened and then abandoned. So if you've ever felt haunted by someone who barely touched your life, you're not broken. You're just carrying something deeper, and it's time we talk about it. Frank didn't fall in love with her. He fell in love with the part of himself she revealed. Strange, isn't it? We spend years thinking we know what love feels like, that spark, the thrill, the comfort. But sometimes it's none of those things. Sometimes love feels like recognition, like someone walked into your life, and without even meaning to, held up a mirror to a part of you that had been asleep for decades. That's what she did for Frank. She didn't rescue him. She didn't try to fix him. She didn't even ask the big questions. She just saw him, quietly, clearly. Carl Jung called this projection an unconscious transfer of our deepest longings, wounds, and archetypes onto another person. And most of the time we don't even realize we're doing it. We say, "She gets me. I've never felt this way before. She brings something out of me I didn't know existed." But what's really happening is internal. It's not that she brought it out. It's that you finally let something rise to the surface. Because for once, it felt safe enough. For Frank, that meant feeling things he hadn't felt since his 20s. Wonder, softness, playfulness, that deep ache to be known, not for what he provides, but for who he is when he's not performing. She didn't do anything extraordinary. She just didn't interrupt the parts of him trying to wake up, and that's what made her unforgettable. She became a symbol, an echo of something sacred, Reminder of the man he could have been if he had grown in freedom instead of responsibility. And when she left, it wasn't her departure that shattered him. It was the silence of that mirror being taken away. Jung said, "We meet ourselves, time, and again in 1,000 disguises, and sometimes that disguise is the eyes of a woman who never planned to stay." So no, Frank didn't fall in love with her. He fell in love with who he was in her presence. And now, he doesn't know how to find that man again. Not without her. Not yet. You'd think that kind of emotional connection, the kind Frank felt, would make a man want to stay. But often, that's exactly when he disappears, not because he doesn't care, not because he's playing games, but because something deep inside him panics. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the part of us we keep hidden, even from ourselves. And when someone gets too close enough to see not just who we pretend to be, but who we really are, that shadow rises. It says, "You're not ready for this." She's going to see the cracks. You're not enough. At the same time, modern psychology explains it with something more clinical: emotional flooding. Dr. John Gottman observed that when men experience intense emotional stimuli, especially around vulnerability or intimacy, they often shut down. Their heart rate spikes, blood pressure rises, cognitive processing slows. In short, their body goes into fight, flight, or freeze, and most choose freeze. So when Frank started feeling things he hadn't felt in decades, he didn't lean in, he pulled away. Not because he wanted to, but because he was overwhelmed. With her, he wasn't in control. He wasn't the strong one, the fixer, the provider. He was just human. And for a man who's spent a lifetime being needed but rarely known, being truly seen can feel less like love and more like exposure. That's the paradox. The deeper the connection, the more dangerous it feels. So he does what so many men over 50 do. He retreats. He gets quiet. He builds walls and calls it thinking things through. He sabotages something sacred just to feel safe again. But here's the truth. He's not running from her. He's running from the part of himself that was starting to awaken. Because if he stays, if he lets her see all of him, the strong, the scarred, the soft, then he has to stop performing. He has to start feeling. And for a man who's been taught to bury pain his entire life, that's terrifying. Have you ever felt this? That moment when someone sees through you, and instead of feeling loved, you feel exposed. If you've ever frozen in that exact moment, you're not alone. Tell me below, what did you do when it got too real? She didn't slam the door. She didn't cry or scream. She didn't even say goodbye. She just left. And that's what haunted Frank the most. Because we know how to fight. We know how to recover from betrayal, from words we can label, from endings we can blame. But how do you grieve something that never gave you a reason? For Frank, it wasn't just a woman walking away. It was the quiet collapse of a connection that had opened up something sacred in him, something raw, unguarded, alive, and now it was gone. Not shattered, just vanished. Carl Jung once said, "What you resist not only persists, it grows." Frank had spent decades resisting his need to be emotionally seen, to be touched not with hands, but with presence. And just as that part of him began to stretch awake, she walked out without a word. That silence, it wasn't neutral, it was surgical. It reached deeper than any spoken goodbye ever could, because it didn't just remove her from his life. It removed him from who he was when he was with her. And here's something most men won't say out loud. They've felt that before. Long before love, long before adulthood. They felt it as boys, when their father ignored their questions, when their mother stopped looking them in the eye, when the people they longed for most met their emotions with silence. That's not just hurt, that's wiring, and when it repeats in adulthood, when a woman offers a glimpse of real connection and then disappears without a trace. It doesn't just hurt. It reactivates. A survival response. Because to a man like Frank, silence doesn't just mean loss. It means danger. It means shame. It means you were too much. Or worse, you were never really seen at all. That's why her absence lingers longer than her presence. Because she became more than a person. She became a symbol of the one time he let himself be fully felt and was met with nothing. Gottman calls this stonewalling when it happens in conflict, but in the realm of the soul, it's more than that. It's the withdrawal of energy, of recognition, of resonance. And to a man who has kept parts of himself hidden his entire life, that silence is devastating because it doesn't tell him he failed. It tells him he never mattered. But here's what Frank couldn't see yet, that her silence wasn't a rejection. It was her own form of self-protection, her own return to center, and just maybe the echo she left wasn't there to punish him, but to pull him deeper. Frank used to think he missed her, the way she laughed quietly at his dry jokes, the way she leaned in when he spoke, like his words actually mattered, the way she didn't fill the silence. She honored it. But over time, something in him shifted. It wasn't her voice that echoed. It was who he became in her presence. It wasn't her perfume or her softness or the way she looked at the world. It was the way he looked at the world when she was around. Carl Jung said, "We don't just fall in love with a person. We fall in love with the symbol they awaken within us." And she had become just that, a symbol, not of romance, but of remembrance. She reminded him of something buried, a version of himself that had long gone silent under the weight of responsibility, routine, and years of being what others needed. That's why she was unforgettable, not because she was perfect, not because she was the one, but because she activated the self, the deepest layer of his identity that had never fully come to light. In Jungian terms, she embodied the anima, the feminine image within the male unconscious that holds mystery, feeling, creativity, and soul. Most men spend their lives projecting that anima outward, onto lovers, fantasies, muses. But few ever realize that what they're chasing isn't a woman, it's wholeness, and that's what Frank couldn't name, what he couldn't let go of. Because when she left, she didn't take herself. She took the access point, the portal, through which he had met a deeper version of himself. Her absence wasn't just painful, it was disorienting. Not because she was irreplaceable, but because what she touched inside him couldn't be reawakened by anyone else. Not yet. So he didn't move on. Not really. He dated. He remarried. He smiled in photos. But in quiet moments, he'd still catch glimpses of that man. The one she met. The one she made possible. And he'd feel it. The ache. The mirror. The knowing that someone once saw him, then vanished, taking that version of him with her. For months, Frank didn't speak about her, not to his friends, not to his new wife, not even to himself. But she was there, in the silence between sentences, in the pause before a deep breath, in that aching place behind the ribs where something used to feel full. At first, he tried what most men try: distraction, more work, more noise, more surface-level peace. But none of it stuck, because what left with her wasn't just romance. It was his sense of connection to something larger, to himself, to truth, to soul. And one day, without meaning to, he found himself sitting in the public library, not scrolling, not searching, just listening to a book, Carl Jung's Memories, Dreams, Reflections. The words didn't hit like advice, they hit like recognition. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens. Frank felt something shift. That night, he sat on the edge of his bed and asked a question most men never ask. He sat down. He didn't pray, didn't reach for a book, didn't turn on the TV. He just sat, And then the question came, what if I've spent my whole life avoiding my real self? He thought about his childhood, how he learned early to be quiet, helpful, strong, how emotions weren't safe, how softness was punished, how no one ever really asked, "How do you feel?" Only, "Did you finish your homework? Did you lock the garage? Did you fix the leak?" And suddenly he saw it. He saw how every relationship he'd had wasn't just about love, it was about control, about being useful, about being chosen, but never truly known. That woman, the one who vanished, she never asked him to be useful. She didn't want his solutions, she just wanted his presence, and that broke something open, because it wasn't about her. It never really was. She was the catalyst, but the pain he felt, that was his own soul knocking on the door after years of being locked out. Frank started journaling, reading psychology, walking without headphones, not to become someone better, but to finally meet the man who'd been living underneath the performance. This is what Jung called individuation, the sacred process of integrating the lost, repressed, unloved parts of ourselves, not for anyone else, not to win someone back, but to become whole. It's not about healing to be chosen. It's about healing so you can choose yourself, with clarity, with dignity, with peace. Frank didn't need another relationship to feel alive again. He needed permission to feel, to grieve, to awaken. And strangely, it was her absence that gave it to him. It took Frank almost a year to understand. She wasn't the one. She wasn't some once-in-a-lifetime love story he missed. She wasn't the woman he was meant to grow old with. She was something more elusive, more sacred. She was the mirror, the one that, for a brief and quiet season, reflected back to him the man he had forgotten, or maybe never fully met. In her presence, he didn't feel like he had to perform. He didn't need to impress or protect or fix. He could just be, and in that being, he touched something deeper than comfort. He touched truth. Carl Jung believed that the people who awaken us aren't always meant to stay. They come in like a dream, soft, vivid, strange, and their departure hurts not because they're gone, but because they leave us with ourselves. And that's what she did. She wasn't a destination. She was a compass, a pointer toward his inner world, the one he had abandoned. For decades, while building a life, a career, a family, and perhaps the greatest gift she gave him was the emptiness he felt when she walked away. Because in that silence, he finally had to listen, not to her, but to the voice within, the one that said, "You've spent your life trying to be chosen, but have you ever chosen yourself?" That's the thing no one tells you about real love, the kind that rattles your soul and then disappears. It's not always meant to be held, it's meant to wake you up. She wasn't unforgettable because of who she was. She was unforgettable because of who he became, however briefly, when he stood beside her, and when she left, she didn't leave with the best parts of him. She simply showed him they were there all along. So no, she wasn't the one. She was the moment the mask cracked, the mirror that revealed the man beneath the armor. Love like that isn't about possession, it's about liberation. And some women, without meaning to, don't enter your life to stay. They enter your life so you can finally come home to yourself. Frank never heard from her again. No message, no explanation, no closure. And for a long time, that felt cruel. Until one day, in the quiet of an early morning, he sat alone by the window, coffee in hand, and realized she didn't stay to be chosen. She came to show him, himself. That was her role, not to fill the empty places, not to complete him, but to shine a brief and brilliant light on the path inward, then step aside. And when he finally understood that, he stopped chasing her memory. Not because he forgot, but because he no longer needed her to remind him of what was already inside. Carl Jung taught that the soul doesn't seek comfort, it seeks wholeness, and wholeness often comes not from what stays, but from what breaks us open and leaves. So we have no choice but to rebuild from truth. She was never his possession. She was his awakening, and the most powerful part. She didn't need to explain, didn't need to come back, didn't need to validate his pain. Her silence said enough, because the love that awakens us doesn't cling, it doesn't beg to be understood. It simply offers a mirror and trusts that one day we'll have the courage to look into it. Frank did, and what he saw wasn't the man she left, but the man she helped him find. If you've ever loved someone who didn't stay, who didn't fight, who didn't say goodbye, and yet somehow they became the most unforgettable part of your life, you're not alone. Maybe you've never spoken about it. Maybe you thought it was weakness. Maybe you told yourself real men move on. But silence doesn't mean healing, and not all love is meant to last. Some love is meant to wake us up. So I want to ask you, man to man, have you ever lost someone, but felt like you were really losing a part of yourself? Have you ever met a woman who didn't ask much, but somehow made you feel more you than you've ever been? And when she left, did it feel like the light went with her? If any part of this story touched something in you, share it below. Don't hold it in. Don't hide it behind logic or shame. Your story could be the mirror someone else needs. Because when we speak from the soul, not to impress, not to get sympathy, but to simply be real, we create a space where healing becomes possible. Leave a comment. Tell us your moment, your turning point, the goodbye that didn't end you, but maybe just began something else. You're not weak for feeling this. You're awake, and that's the strongest thing a man can be.